Hi there, I'm Victoria Williams, and in this video I'm going to show you the method for working through a grade 7 adding a figured bass question. We'll start with the cadences and key changes, move on to suspensions, then leading note tonic progressions, and then everything else. We start with the easiest parts of the piece and work through and leave the most difficult parts until the end. This is the piece we're going to be working on. If you can't see it very well, just click on full screen so that the notes appear more clearly. You can see that the beginning figures have already been done for you. So for bars 1, 2 and half of bar 3, the figures are already in place. After that, we can see a little star symbol, and these are the places where we will need to add a figure. I've numbered them just to make it easier to show what I'm talking about. The very first thing you need to do is work out what key the piece is in. The key signature, well, the absence of a key signature, plus the accidental G sharp tells us that this piece starts in A minor. However, it's not in A minor all the way through. In bar 3, we've got a C sharp, a different accidental leading to a D. At this point, the piece is modulating through the key of D minor. We know it's D minor and not D major because of the F natural in the melody line. The minims or half notes used here show us that there is a cadence. Whenever there is a longer note used like this, it's very likely that there is a cadence. But the notes in both parts are E, so it's not going to be a cadence in D minor. More likely we've moved back to A minor at this point. In bar 7, a D sharp is introduced, and that's leading up to an E, and this is showing us that the key here is changing to E minor. Again, we know it's E minor because of the G natural in the bass part. These keys are really important to keep in your mind, so it's a really good idea just to label up the piece with whichever keys the piece is moving through, something like this. Now at each of those places where the music changes key, we're going to find chord 1 or 5. Remember that chords 1 and 5 are the ones we need to fix a new key. I've shaded those places here, and these are the chords we're going to work on first. Chord 1 is a D minor chord and the bass note is D, so this is root position. Now I'm going to write in 5-3 so that I know that I've done this chord, and I'll erase it later. Now we'll move on to chord 5. This is now back into the key of A minor, and it's a cadence, and the bass note is E, so this signifies that it's going to be an imperfect cadence. Remember, at a cadence you were going to expect a root position chord. So this is a root position E major chord. Remember that in a minor key we always need a major dominant chord. So we're going to have to put a sharp in the figure to show that the third of the chord G is sharpened. In chord 12, we've modulated to the key of E minor, and here the bass note is G, so this is going to be a first inversion chord. We need to figure it with a 6. We'll now move on to the end of the extract, where a cadence will nearly always be expected, and in this case the bass line, which is static because we've just got two Bs, they're an octave apart but it's the same note. This means that a cadential 6/4 is going to fit at this point. Don't forget that the dominant 5A chord is going to need a sharpened third, which would be D sharp in this case. Next, we're going to scan the bass line for any places where a suspension might fit. For a suspension, the bass line again has to be static, so we're expecting the same bass note but 2 asterisks to show 2 different chords. There's an example in bar 4. The bass line is F, and we've got 2 asterisks for chords 3 and 4, and the melody line changes from E to D. It's a good idea to check that all the criteria for a suspension have been filled before trying to write one. You need to check that the melody note and the bass note form a dissonance. Well, here we've got F in the bass and E in the melody, and that is a dissonance of a 7th. You also need to check that the melody note existed in the previous chord. Well, here you can see the E was tied over to the previous chord, so that's fine. You need to check that the suspension falls on a strong beat. Well, it does, it's on the first beat of the bar. and also that the melody falls rather than leaps. And yes, it does, E falls to D. So all the criteria for a suspension have been met. To work out the numbers to use in the figure for the suspension, you need to work out the interval between the bass note and the melody note. F in the bass and E in the melody makes an interval of a seventh, and F to D makes an interval of a sixth. So in this case, the suspension is 7/6. So we've looked at the cadences, we've looked at the key changes, and we've looked at the suspensions. The next thing to do is look for places where a leading note rises to a tonic. In this piece, there are two places where we can find a leading note, which is G sharp, rising to a tonic, which is A. This is chords 7 to 8 and 9 to 10. Whenever the leading note rises to the tonic, we would expect a progression of 5 to 1. But remember, this could also be 5/7 to 1, the dominant seventh, or it could be a substitute dominant chord, for example, chord 7. Let's take a look at chord 7 first. We have a bass note B and a melody note G sharp, so it could be chord 7B. Remember, that's a diminished chord, so it's always used in the first inversion. Or we could look at the chord another way and think of it as a dominant chord. It could be chord 5, but it can't be chord 5C because we can't use a second inversion chord in this position. It's not a cadential 6/4, and it's not a passing 6/4 either. Although the bass line moves by step, this chord falls on a strong beat, and a passing 6/4 always falls on a weak beat. So it can't be chord 5C. However, dominant seventh chords are fine to use in second inversion. So here we could use a second inversion dominant seventh chord. So that would be E, G sharp, B and D. In fact, for chord 7, you could use either a 7B chord or a dominant seventh C chord. I'm going to go for the dominant seventh. The second inversion dominant seventh chord is figured with a 6 and a 5. But don't forget, we also need to sharpen the sixth of the chord, the G sharp. Moving on to chord 8, this is the root position tonic chord, so we just add a 5/3. In our second leading note tonic progression, we've got in chord 9 a G sharp and a B, so this fits a dominant first inversion chord. We use a 6, and in chord 10, the A and the C fit a root position tonic chord. Now that we've done all the easy bits, it's time to move on to what's left and work out the slightly more tricky chords. Let's go back to chord 2. We've got an E in the bass and an E in the melody, so we need to look at the root position and first inversion chords, which will work with E. We also need to bear in mind that at this point it could be in D minor or we could be in A minor. We're kind of in between the two keys here. First, let's see what happens if we assume that the bass note E is the root of a chord. In the key of D minor, this would be an E minor chord, but in the key of A minor, it would be an E major chord. Let's see what happens if we assume that the E is the third of a triad. In the key of D minor, this would be a chord of 7B, C sharp, E, G, whereas in the key of A minor, it would be a chord 3, and we would expect the C to be a C natural to make a major chord. Let's add in the Roman numeral chords so we can try and figure out more easily what's going on here. In this case, the Roman numerals show us that we're looking for a chord that will sit happily between two chord 4s in the key of A minor. And really only chord 5 will do that. That's a normal progression, whereas chord 7 isn't so common. It can be useful to remember that the primary chords 1, 4 and 5 always work together without any problems. Again, don't forget, because it's chord 5 in a minor key, we need to sharpen the third. The next chord we need to work on is chord 6. We've got a C in the bass and a G in the melody. C and G only work together in the chord of C major, and because C is the root, this is a root position 5/3 chord. The next chord to do is chord 11. The bass note is A and the melody note is D sharp. This is an augmented fourth higher than the bass. You will only see an interval like this in a dominant seventh chord. The chord we're looking at here would be the dominant seventh of E minor, so that's a B major chord with an added A. This is a third inversion dominant seventh chord because it is the seventh of the chord, the A, which is the note in the bass. A third inversion chord is notated with the figures 4-2. And in this case, because the fourth above the bass, which is D, is sharpened, we need to add an accidental sharp to the figured bass as well. Finally, we're on chord 13, the last one we need to figure. We have an A in the bass and an E in the melody, so these two notes will fit with the tonic A minor chord in root position. At this point, what you should do is look at any bars which contain accidentals in either the melody, in the bass part, or in the figured bass, and just double check that the figures contain any accidentals which will be needed. When you're happy that that's done, erase all the 5-3 chords which are not part of a 6-4-5-3 progression, but always leave in the accidental if necessary. For example, here I've erased the figures 5-3 from chords 1, 2, 5, 6, 8, 10, 13 and 16. I've left in the sharp signs in chords 2 and 5, and in chord 15 I've left in the complete 5-3 because it follows a 6-4 in the previous chord. And it's finished. But if you'd like more music theory lessons for your grade 7 ABRSM theory exam, come and visit us at mymusictheory.com.